name's Petra Tschakert. I'm a new staff member with McCassie, and I'm very delighted to be here. And I'm particularly grateful for all of you who are here in the room and those of you who are online, because this is my first talk at Curtin, so I shall remember this one. So thanks for welcoming me to ACAT, and I want to preface this by saying that, well, me too, I obviously acknowledge that we're meeting here on the lands of the Wajak Noongar people, and that I gladly pay my respects to their elders past and present and emerging. I also want to say that I'm probably the odd person in the new group in McCassie. I'm a human environment geographer by training. So you will hear quite a bit of how geographers approach questions like affective spaces, and how I do, but I also have a strong interest and some background in applied anthropology. And most of my work has been on climate change, and I'll lead you a little bit through it. So title, yes, Walking Journeys into Everyday Climatic-Affective Atmospheres. And I will be speaking about a project that's an ARC Discovery Grant called Locating Loss from Climate Change in Everyday Places. So that's the setting for the presentation and the paper that is behind it. And I'll explain what my connection to loss is, because that's at the core of everything. So this does not move forward. What am I doing wrong? So one moment. So while we try to get this moving forward, so the context of my presentation is to see whether or not we could use the post-apocalypse as a discourse for mobilizing emotions, affect, to help us to move towards climate action, right? And to embrace and enfranchise loss in a way that is constructive rather than, alienating or pathologic. Okay, how did you do it? Oh, I have to use this one here, not this one. Okay, so that's, oh yeah? It's counterintuitive to use the mouse here. So this is what I want to do. And the methodological hook is a walking methodology, and I'll lead you through it. And where we ultimately want to land is some kind of politics of hope. Good. So I will be speaking about I and we, because this is really a collaboration with team members from the ARC project, particularly this paper that I just mentioned, which is under review, with Pierre Horvitz, he's at ECU, and Chantal Bourgault at UWA. So we have been doing this together, and that's what you're going to hear. And how it works, interesting. Okay, so loss in the context of climate change. There has been significant discussion within international debates and the entire UNFCCC, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, on how to deal with loss and damage. Because we understand that adaptation and mitigation are not enough, right? Loss is occurring, damage is occurring, and this has been enormously contested for the last 10 to 15 years. So damage is usually defined as something which is reversible and loss as irreversible. And because of pressure from particularly small island development states and least developed countries, in 2012, finally, there was a recognition that loss needs to be taken into account, 2013, at the Conference of the Parties of the UNFCCC in Warsaw. And it's called the Warsaw International Mechanism on Loss and Damage. And there are various working areas behind it, and one of them deals with how do we make visible and assess non-economic or non-market losses or intangible losses, right? All those things that are not easy to measure. And I've been part of this one working group, and the entire work that you see here, let me see if I can move this a little further up, has to do with how do we, from a social science perspective, try to grapple with loss. And what is it? And you can see some of those publications here. And the hook here has always been, well, we're interested in loss based on what people value in their lives. And if they cannot protect what they value, well, then maybe we can talk about loss. And so this is just to give you a flavor here. Loss in the context of climate negotiations is still a very hot potato. It is mentioned in the Paris Agreement. This is the big agreement that we refer to when we talk about climate change. In Article 8, says, we acknowledge, the parties acknowledge loss. However, the very last sentence on Article 8 says, but that doesn't mean we have any obligation or historic responsibilities, and there's certainly no obligation for compensation. Right? So this is the constellation internationally. So our work has been, what's a socially engaged science of loss? How do we work based on what people value rather than climate projections? So the premise to that, and that's the only really climate science slide I'm going to show, is the following. If we think about climate adaptation as it is defined here, namely attempts to keep risks to valued objects or objectives at a tolerable level in the face of climate-related hazards, right? Adaptation. If we can keep these risks at a tolerable level, what is tolerable, of course, well, it's highly subjective. We acknowledge that. But if we think about it that way, and then we envision this graphic here, which came out of the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and I've been involved in this, is if we have intensity of adverse impacts and frequency of adverse impacts, some risks down here are going to be acceptable. Fine, I can live with them. In here are these tolerable risks. Like we may say, okay, not ideal, but we can manage. And somewhere over here is going to be the adaptation limit. That's kind of the point at which adaptation fails to protect what people value. Then we get into intolerable risks, and this is where kind of the loss space is. So that's how we have been trying to conceptualize loss in the context of climate change. And so what this project really is about then is to see if we can advance a theory around the trade-offs people make between the many things they cherish and value and potentially are already losing or risk losing in the future. Can we come up with a theory of value trade-offs to explain how these decisions are made? And can we actively and preemptively engage with loss, grief, and hope, and reevaluate local priorities, nourish empathetic relationships, and help sketch out livable futures? Can we do this through this project? And so what I'm going to talk about is about the project, how we have been approaching it. It's a WA project that started with 400 participants, sorry, in an online survey, and roughly 100 then said they want to stay on board, and they have been working with us over the last 3 years, on and off, to dive into various aspects of loss. And as I said, WA, roughly a 400-kilometer transect from Attadale, south of the river, to the Eastern Wheat Belt, Southern Cross. So imagine it like this. So, and I'm going to read several parts from the manuscript because it's just so well articulated, I find. So bear with me. So here what I want to do is to focus on emotions and everyday realities and routines, to explore individual affective spaces and their entanglements with the wider sphere of environmental and climate change. Linking what we have done or trying to do on the project on climate change to the growing scholarship on affective atmospheres seems really useful. The term affective atmospheres was introduced by Ben Anderson, a cultural political geographer, and it suggests that affect constitutes an atmosphere, an energy force or feeling of a place or situation that is shaped, shifted, and undone through the interaction of human and non-human bodies, practices, materials, moods, sensations, all of which compel individuals to act. While some, including Anderson himself, interpret affect as a sensory experience that precedes cognitive emotions, others insist upon the interplay of affect and emotion, and most prominently so Sarah Ahmed, and her phenomenological work on the cultural politics of emotions emphasizes the connection between embodied affects and cognitively expressed emotions, and the way in which these circulate through bodies, discourse, and practice in various places. Now, place, as we all know, I think, is more than just a mere physical location. Place and the ways people comprehend and experience it is intimately tied to our senses. Southwestern Australia may very well be known for its Mediterranean climate, with hot, dry summers and mild, wet winters, now also driven by increasing maximum and minimum temperatures and declining annual and winter rainfalls, right? So that's one description. However, it is the climatic affective atmospheres that the wonderful Blanche Burley argues that expose how these climate trends and threats, such as fires, extreme heat, droughts, flooding, and erosions by rivers, are entangled with how people feel about where they live. That's what these climatic affective atmospheres are about. And this entails attention to how daily weather conditions, seasonal changes, climate variability become active participants in placemaking, and hence shape the ways people, places, bodies, and emotions and affect are relationally imbricated. Hence, an explicit focus on place and emotions not only teases out aspects of identity and belonging and power and politics, but it also rehumanizes and re-embodies how place and space are understood. Emotions matter in everyday spaces as they offer unique language through which to comprehend why people engage with the places they live in, for emotional connections and investments with other fellow beings and earth, water, and air. Right? So that's kind of the context behind affective atmospheres. It is not surprising then that scholars pursuing place-based research employ a variety of terms such as emplacement, inhabiting place, ethics in place, and critical place inquiry to examine the affective spatialities and temporalities of place. And this has been influenced largely, as we see examples here, by feminist, anti-colonial, more than human praxis, oriented more towards just futures. Now, affect, emotions, and emotional narratives are also at the very core of environmental movements. And emotions such as hope, anger, and fear tend to fly particularly high in climate debates. Early discussions have shifted from focusing primarily on this super wicked problem that we're dealing with to coming to grips with the diverse beliefs and values that underpin individual and collective visions for a livable future. More recently, contestations have centered on what narratives and tactics best mobilize climate action. And what are the narratives we need? And this is where the critical role of emotions comes in. Greta Thunberg's speech, 2019, at the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland, encapsulates the tension between hope and fear, so-called positive and negative emotions, with which to face the imminent apocalypse. Right? This is the discourse that she uses. Now, action can be mobilized by seemingly contradictory emotional narratives, as Carl Kostegard and Håkan Törn, two Swedish sociologists, illustrate. I find this paper super fascinating. Some narratives, they argue, such as those by established environmental organizations like Greenpeace, mobilize through future-oriented optimism rather than despair and resignation, which are seen as paralyzing. And there's certainly a sociocultural logic to that, as my colleague Leslie Head, a geographer, states, because there's a deep-seated cultural pressure in the West not to be a doom and gloom merchant. Right? So this optimism, let's just keep going, it'll work out. Other environmental narratives are fueled by negative, utopian energies. They implore that the threat is unavoidable and all actions ought to be devoted to curbing the forthcoming catastrophe. The environmental youth movement and its rhetoric, including Thunberg's quote here, adopts such an apocalyptic discourse as it mobilizes mobilizes through fear and rage, as well as anticipatory acts of hope towards restoring this livable order. Right? Let's just get back to what is good for us. Indeed, emotions have played for a long time a significant role in harnessing energy for collective action. The literature on emotions in social movements has particularly emphasized the mobilizing role of anger, despite the negative effects of anger on activist well-being and its limitations in terms of sustaining action over time. This type of mobilization relies on transforming other emotive expressions, particularly fear, anxiety, sadness, and despair, into anger and protest. And again, Thunberg's leadership falls under that. Yet, there's a third possible environmentalism, as Tschakert in turn argue, and that's the one of the post-apocalypse. And this is where it gets interesting. It signals that catastrophe is already upon us, that fearing it as a future occurrence is misdirected and preventing it futile, and that coming to grips with it, with inevitable loss, is an essential component of active salvage and recovery. As Tschakert in turn argue, the post-apocalyptic narratives mobilize largely out of anger over injustices, where loss is seen not as paralyzing, but as a point of departure for political action. Okay? So how can we work with loss? For them, it is at this juncture that the paradox of hope materializes. By accepting and verbalizing loss, contesting societal wrongs, and acknowledging grief, it is possible to free imagination and embrace translocal solidarities in support of livable futures. This kind of hope is both reparative and political, and hence radically different from naive optimism that everything will just work out. Rather, this version of hope aligns with Donna Haraway's notion of staying with the trouble, or Jim Bendel's call for relinquishment as part of the adaptation agendas. We have to stay with it. To be clear here, establishing so-called passive emotions such as fear, sadness, and despair to wrestle with the climate crisis should not be misinterpreted as eco-paralysis. And that's not what it is. On the contrary, accepting the catastrophe and engaging with loss and mourning enables us to reposition ourselves vis-a-vis multiple other beings. And these guys say that we need to drop the premise that all mobilization needs hope in the sense of upbeat, optimistic messages. The acceptance of loss can be a wellspring of new forms of activism and new forms of struggles, including attempts to salvage what still can be saved and demanding redress and settling wrongs. So can we use it as a springboard? As such, the post-apocalyptic narratives offer a radical and paradoxical form of hope that materializes once we're able to reimagine ourselves differently on the ground and understand that we need translocal solidarities that are relational, right? Where we develop responsibilities. And as such, this post-apocalypse becomes part of our experience rather than being part of a distant future. It's here, it's now. How do we work with it? Yeah, so that's kind of the background to how I want to proceed with our case study. So unlike many youth protagonists in most scholarship on affective atmosphere and climate education, the participants in our study in Western Australia were mostly middle-aged residents. We focus on how they navigate emotions about environmental and other changes affecting familiar and cherished places. And we were particularly interested in probing for the likely tension between the so-called positive and negative emotions, and you will see, as well emotions that are considered more active than those typically labeled as passive. Overall, this research problematizes the persistent equivalence of anger with political mobilization and the sidelining at the same time of other emotions as passive and useless. Our ultimate aim is to understand how recognizing or enfranchising a full range of emotions might support the collective task of realizing livable and responsible futures. How can we do this? And so we deployed an in situ and mobile methodology that I had used in work in Ghana before, and you can see the article here, and we call it walking journeys. Methodologies to understand in or out situ experiences and phenomena have become increasingly popular as they make it possible to elicit these experiential place-based knowledges. Roland Foley and his colleagues argue that out situ approaches, or best understood as in situ outdoors, such as go or walk along interviews and walking and storying, allows researchers to engage with embodiment and emotion at diverse temporal scales. Such methodologies make visible the agency of place with its abundant human and more than human matterings, as well as the webs of connections and responsibilities that are linked to them. For Foley and colleagues, walking with research participants is also imbued with an ethic of care that entails attentive listening and well-being and being within, including receptivity to emotional and affective experiences. Not surprisingly, such situated and relational research has lots to offer in the geographies of health and well-being. As some write, walking methodologies bring to the fore how places are intertwined with many of the current crises, including environmental destruction and climate change tied to all the colonial legacies we're dealing with. By tapping into both the affective and political dimensions of place, such approaches enable situated, relational, responsible, and ethical encounters with past, present, and future worlds. So that's what we have tried to do. In the project sequence of iterative engagement, so over 3 years with roughly 100 people, the walking journeys followed a participatory sit-down mapping activity conducted with 106 participants who had completed the initial survey and wanted to stay along. The mapping exercise explored lived values. These are the yellow dots here. Lived values such as safety, entertainment, community or sense of community, and the green dots here, which we call the environmental values such as recreational, therapeutic values, across spatial scales, so from a person's residence all the way out to the globe. And as part of this activity, participants also identified special places, places of the heart, that are really important to them. And we had these heart-shaped sticky dots, and everybody could place 3 of them on places that were just very special to them. And the red dots are threats to the many things people value at all kinds of scales. So 80% of participants identified their home as a place of heart, maybe not surprising. 2/3 in somewhere in their surrounding environments, and 1/4 overseas, and the rest in between. And most often the reasons cited for identifying the home were, well, it is our home, or particular characteristics in the environment that would provide solace, for example, or ties to family well-being and cultural heritage. Where do you think it is best? Should I move this over here? Maybe. Okay, here we go. Value mapping. I love doing stuff like this. Now, home is a core locus in which spatiality, temporality, social relations, materiality, memories, and meaning come together. Ideally, and bearing in mind that very often many homes fall short of these ideals, home is also a place of ontological security, where dwellers can achieve a sense of continuity, maintain self-identity, and realize full agency. So as such, home is both physical and emotional, real and imagined, and always in the making for the daily exercising of agencies. Always in the making. And indeed, our mapping activity of values across various scales, participants identified the home, and often the suburb or the shire, as places over which they felt they had most control. So these things were having control and having influence, how far they would stretch out. For some scholars, there's also a vital anticipatory element encapsulated in home, because it is irrevocably entangled not only with the daily routines and rhythms, memories and nostalgia, but also dreams and fears for the future. In this way, homes are also a locus of emotions like fear, anger, and potentially post or apocalyptic visions. Indeed, a home, as we know, can also be unmade, damaged, divested, destroyed. Fires is an example. So that's what we started with. And then we wanted to go to some of these heart-shaped locations, places of the heart. What's happening in there? Walking with participants to one of their places of the heart was thus an effort to acknowledge such affective dimensions of place and in or on their properties or around them. In the present, with respect to observed changes and in anticipation of what the future may bring. So we walked with 69 participants, and we have to say that all our participants were non-Indigenous, with more women than men, and more than 2/3 over the age of 55, which is reflective of the overall self-selected sample. This demographic admittedly tended to privilege the perspectives of what Val Plumwood has critiqued as individualist and proximate places and imaginaries at the expense of the other places, beings, and relations that sustain them, shadow places, particularly in settler colonial contexts. However, and that's the counter narrative here, as Petra and colleagues, and I'll come back to them later, argue in their manifesto for shadow places, we cannot shy away from the interrogating Western white privilege from the inside in order to expand from this vantage point and grapple with the relationality of place and the webs of connectedness that define our daily existence, right? We have to grapple with this. So our methodology is really best seen as a participatory walking interview. We often walked some distance with the interviewee, moving through a place that we talked about. But at other times, the conversation was less mobile, for example, when we're sitting in a backyard. We had three main questions. Why is this place special to you? When you come here, how do you get here? Why do you come? What's the first thing you notice? And do you have a name for this place? What changes have you noticed in this place over the last 10 to 20 years? And how do you imagine this place in 25 years' time? And what prospects do you see for its future? And at each of these steps, we ask participants to describe their emotions using what is known as the Geneva Emotions Wheel. It's a research tool developed by Klaus Scherer and colleagues at the Swiss Center for Affective Sciences. The wheel arranges 20 identified emotions as pair along a horizontal axis, there you go, with the so-called positive emotions on the right and the negative emotions on the left, and the vertical axis that divides them into active at the top and passive at the bottom. And participants, as you just saw in the picture, had a laminated copy of this, and we used beans, 5 beans, to say, okay, what is it? You know, is it a 1, is it a 4, is it a 5, to help them indicate that score. What's important to know here is that Scherer does not in any way discriminate here, right? He says all emotions are important and they're all motivational. And we know from recent insights from eco-psychology and environmental psychology that supported enfranchising a range of emotions, however passive they may appear, is fundamental because they all have political potential. And none of them should be dismissed as pathological, right? As we know, it often happens in the context of eco-anxiety. So most of those walking journeys took, well, 40 minutes to 2 hours, 2.5 hours. We recorded, audio recorded, with a note taker to note down the most important elements, and we had a sketch of where we went. So let's look at the results. Places of the heart. So remember, these are the special places. So we did 100+ hours in these walking journeys, and we had the privilege of being invited inside many places of the heart. We meandered through, around, and into small veggie patches and extensively landscaped gardens, modest government housing and mansion-like residences, cemeteries and churches, and up and down distinctive landscape features across Nuga Buja, such as granite outcrops, creeks, river valleys, and pools, all of which, of course, are imbued by indigenous history and cultural significance. We also visited hard-worked farmland and barren agricultural trial plots, well-maintained parks, public gardens, dog path in dense urban settings, remote bush and dense forests, this pinkish-white salt lake, a shrine dedicated to a lost friend, a small-town theater, and even an old shed remodeled as a tree changer art workshop where we were part of a cocktail party, which was my favorite. It was so good. Given that these were all special places and spaces in which people relax, cherish memories, seek peace and solitude, and find therapeutic escapes and solace, almost all emotions, as we would expect, conveyed something positive. They emphasized enjoyment, pleasure, happiness, joy, involvement, interest, pride, elation, particularly the last one for places that people had most control over, their homes and their gardens. Wonderment and awe was often expressed with natural settings outside the immediate home boundaries, with places that induce spatial and temporal reflections, such as being able to remove oneself from the oppressiveness of the city, and for some turning into Aboriginal worldviews and connectedness. And so you wouldn't be surprised. These were the happy places of the heart. Okay. However, once the conversations moved to changes observed in these places, changes observed last 10 to 20 years, the balance of the wheel shifted. And you see an analysis here. The climatic-affective atmospheres became more imbued with worry, fear, sadness, despair, irritation, anger, disappointment, and regret, particularly with regards to weather and climatic changes, including increased risk of bushfires, ecosystem changes, environmental degradation, development, and the interconnectedness between all of them. These negative emotions, both passive and active, bottom and top, affect sense of place, place attachment, and personal meaning making. They were all well captured also in the literature on solidarities, a term coined by Glenn Albrecht, and maybe some of you know that term, which indexes emotional and existential distress and grief triggered by place transformations. They're no longer what they used to be. Albrecht and colleagues documented ample use of references to passive emotions like I feel worried, I feel saddened, I feel disappointed, when developing an environmental distress scale based on responses from the effects of open coal mining in the Upper Hunter Valley. And most studies so far in the space of solidarities have used surveys or Likert scale responses, strongly agree to strongly disagree. Yet recent research recommends in-depth qualitative methods, this is what we're good at, to tease out these complexities that we're interested in. And our walking journeys attempted to do just that. And certainly it supported, the results supported, that there are pessimistic outlooks for the future. How often? They're often coupled with a sense of hope. So something nonetheless positive. And I'll show you some examples. Some of the men and women we walked with referred directly to climate change, others to local development trends such as infills, and others still talked about political incompetence and failure in governance. So for example, one participant, Carol from Darlington, so in the hills, was exasperated about what she and her husband see as irresponsible bushfire risk management. She said, when considering the reality of hotter and longer summers and the increased frequency and severity of bushfires, and she gave it a maximum score of irritation and anger. It was very clear. It's a 5. She said, the government ignores the fire risk. We've got national parks on 3 sides of our property. Their prescribed burning is inadequate. There's the increased fuel load all around us and the risk of out-of-control fires. This restricts our lifestyle. We don't go away over the summer so we can protect the house. I'm not happy when I hear helicopters coming. We've had a huge bushfire earlier in the year. It's devastating when you go out for walks and there are dead animals and it's still smoldering. With regards to the future, she expressed irritation, sadness, especially, as she said, if local authorities keep what they're doing, then bushfires will be unmanageable. An extreme sadness and disappointment when considering her home destroyed by a fire. So these visceral concerns, however, are intertwined with some kind of involvement and interest, something positive, trying to keep on top of things to protect, stay, and defend. Jess, a farmer near Meriden, shared her substantial worries and disappointment over the driest years, 2010, 2011, that she and her husband had endured. At the same time, and she was gesturing to the trees they planted and the salt bushes, she did not hold back on expressing the tremendous relief and pride that they felt during the bumper year, like 2013. And she envisions a future brimming with positive emotions of joy, intense pleasure, imagining a new house, fully healthy trees, and new crops on a flourishing farm. So yes, there is this absolute, worry, fear, sadness, irritation, anger, disappointment. But people stay positive, hopeful, engaged. Where I think it becomes most interesting is when we start imagining what the future could bring. So this tension between positive and negative emotions, particularly despair and hope, was precariously balanced in our sample. And our participants seemed to be able to hold that tension quite well and reflecting on the changes, but also considering what the future may bring. And it's at that point that we found that most of them were losing hope and tilting more towards powerlessness and despair. The state of emotional tension, as Susan Clayton, who is a psychologist, examines in her work on eco-anxiety, anxiety, and climate grief, is in fact fundamental for how to approach future-oriented thinking and behavior. Anger, worry, anxiety, and grief are intimately tied to place disruption and erosion of place identity, and hence the potential loss of ontological security. However, such psychotheoretic and Albrecht experience, such psychotheoretic experiences and Albrecht expression are generally not pathological, but rather reasonable or healthy response to circumstances. As such, they offer trajectories not only towards paralysis and depression, but towards adaptive action. And that's what we wanted. Clayton explicitly investigates the state of tension between the motivating and the paralyzing effects, this coexistence between getting engaged and giving up. For her, ecotherapy, taking therapy outdoors, allows people to tap into this restorative potential of natural environments, even if these spaces are being eroded. Findings from our walking journey certainly support this view. For example, Petra, a teacher who had observed changes in weather patterns, deteriorating water quality, and fluctuating water levels around the Burlong Pool in Northam, conveyed her simultaneous despair and joy that she feels when wrestling with climate change. She said, the young people, like Greta from Sweden, she talks about only having 20 years to turn things around before climate change, the 1.5 degree, will be irreversible. I've always felt we're on this never-ending stretch of destroying the planet. But now I also feel some joy over the fact that we can make a difference, and that we do have the power to do so, like with innovations to take plastic out of the ocean. So for me, how do we tap into this sense of agency that people nonetheless have in the face of loss and grief? And I want to introduce two key participants now, Luke and Simon, and I'll share quite a bit of how they were articulating what to do in this space of paralysis and restoration. Luke is the secretary of the Climate Justice Union, or WA, and a community activist, and among the younger third of our demographic. He took us through a patch of uncleared Jarrah forest that is part of the Armadale Nature Reserve, a place he crosses 3 to 4 times on his way to work. He has intimate knowledge of the various trees, animals, and wildflowers, and has been able to bear witness to changes over time by thousands of photos taken as cumulative evidence. Luke has a substantial emotional repertoire for being in this place, and mostly high scores on the wheel for sadness, despair, embarrassment, shame, guilt, fear, worry, anger, and also involvement, as well as compassion, connectedness, tenderness, and love. And he can speak to all of those. He feels responsible for minimizing loss and pride over the protective fence that the community had installed. In talking about the heat wave that afflicted Perth metropolitan area in 2012 and 14, the ensuing death of trees and the strong anger and disgust, repulsion he experienced, he said. The heat wave was devastating. Everything dried up. The roots could no longer hold, and trees fell over, some caught on fire. A lot of bobtail lizards during April and May just caught on fire. And due to that devastation, he says, he's now mentally committed. He sees the adverse impacts from climate change and the ever-present threat of development as inevitable. He says, that's my fear. The rate of retreat of trees with rising temperatures is quite high. They may die during my lifetime. I don't want to have to watch these trees die. But it may be a signal of the downturn of our community, and also a planetary one. This may happen despite our best efforts to protect. If we don't protect, it will be even more devastating. Ask if these emotions linger, he said. They're omnipresent. I've lived my entire life in this place. They're always here, but not always at the forefront. Sometimes they're more positive than optimistic. But with the collapse of ecosystems and civilization in general, competition over increasingly scarce resources, we descend into warfare. It's blatantly playing out in front of us. We're potentially already over the edge. For Luke, the future therefore holds mixed prospects. Old trees may well survive, and the bush reserve may remain healthy due to concerted human efforts. It won't happen if people like me don't make it happen. At the same time, he feels that climate change could be overwhelming, with sea level rise and water intrusion conspiring to a doomsday scenario that we may not see in 25 years, or we may. I have zero faith in negative emissions. The amount of methane from wetlands is just overwhelming. It's possible that we've already gone beyond that point of reversal. And he speaks about a challenge at a scale that we've never seen, had never had to deal with before, while also longing and feeling nostalgic for a future that doesn't exist yet. Are so articulate. It's just amazing. Very skilled over his petrol vehicle and the fossil fuel heater he has. Yet he says, I try to hold not too much of that guilt by myself. It's a collective guilt. For me, the hope thing, the reason hope is not here on that wheel is because hope is not so much an emotion. Hope is a decision to go and see a pathway through this. Hope is a decision you make in response to emotions. It is the counter to despair. And I actually think that despair is not an emotion either, he said. Sadness is, and despair is what happens as a result. When it comes to anxiety, he concluded, and that was quite a difficult part of the conversation. You can either tunnel down sadness and fear until you drown in it. And I've nearly drowned a couple of times. Or you can keep getting back up, keep pushing through, and hope that at the end it's all been worth it. How to navigate that tightrope between keeping going and actually giving up. Simon, the other one, a retired environmental scientist and resident in Darlington, wrestles with the same tensions. Thank you, Denise. We joined him on a walk through Delu National Forest at the outskirts of Darlington. Like Luke, he has extensive knowledge about trees, how they have been affected by temperature, stress, and drought, and the disappearance of plants such as dwarf spider orchids. For him, climate change is a slow-moving train wreck with humans who are not well adapted to dealing with it. He worries about the increasingly hot bushfires, the devastating effects on plant survival and recovery, and the gradual disappearance of habitat, also due to encroachment of bush blocks. He sees loss on a massive scale, loss of a world that my grandchildren have to deal with, triggering feelings of sadness, worry, and fear, and also some anger, particularly towards people who just don't get it. In response, Simon now emphasizes what he needs to do for sustainable living, planting native species, capturing water for the house while teaching younger family members and conveying his knowledge to whoever wants to receive it. But behavioral change in others seems slow to come. I haven't found a vehicle, he says, really, apart from this study, for getting involved in changing attitudes. He feels torn regarding prospects for the future, profoundly sad, although not in a state of despair. As humans, he thinks, will just muddle through. Now, I want to land on relational placemaking and the politics of such relational placemaking. We've got Luke to the left and Simon to the right, and they have given permissions to use their pictures. Incredible, incredible people. Which one? Oh, is it too funny? Yeah, Luke and Simon. Navigating climate change and its effect on valued places via emotional terrains is a complex task of negotiation. It's like walking a tightrope between avoiding naive and potentially denialist optimism on the one side and paralyzing fear and depression on the other. In this sense, the post-apocalyptic narrative may well be the trajectory that enables us to get across. It allows us to mobilize negative emotions and energies and accept and embrace loss, enfranchise grief, engage with ongoing difficult struggles, and tap into that paradoxical hope for a desired future. So what I want to argue here, and what we do in the paper together, is that emotions typically understood as passive, such as sadness, despair, worry, and fear, and disappointment and regret, are as powerful as the negative utopian energies and emotions, mostly anger, frustration, and rage, that many of the youth climate activists mobilize with prefiguring livable futures, especially if they're shared, if we can do this together. The literature on activism has long been cognizant of the role of shared emotions as part of formation of political collectives. So this notion of enfranchising emotions such as grief stems from the fact that if it's shared and acknowledged and supported by an empathetic community, then we have a better chance to actually deal with those, so they don't become pathological or paralyzing. In the context of climate change, feelings shared not only with other well-known people have the effect of facilitating an onto epistemological shift into a more relational, imaginary, for being responsive to other human and non-human bodies, as well as sharing a planetary existence with all of them. For so many Earthlings, it is a slow process coming to grips with the webs of connections that inextricably tie people to more than human species and beings and link past generations to those not yet born. Yet growing insights from post-humanism and multi-species justice literature, stretching from the environmental humanities to ecopsychology and indigenous studies, remind us not only of the necessity for, but also the benefits of overcoming the false, antiquated divide between humans and nature. In her research on ecotherapeutic experiences, Susan Clayton emphasizes the restorative energies that become accessible once we let go of this dichotomy. And for these discourses, obviously, ditching human exceptionalism is imperative. In our slow and contemplative walking journeys, we found compelling evidence for the conscious efforts individuals make to nourish connections in their special places, whether they may be scenic spots or some suburban garden. Luke, for example, relates his relationship with old jarrah trees. I have a strong connection to the big jarrah tree in Armadale, the one they built a shopping center around. It's 1,500 years old, one of the oldest and tallest in the world. Aboriginal people have been telling stories underneath this tree for a long time, before the white fellas came. I feel like I'm being called by these jarrah trees. Yet also this particular one in the reserve. The first time I felt a connection with jarrah trees was with this one. I felt this burden and relief when touching the tree. Sometimes I come and sing here, Nunga Buja Jarrah, and I feel compassion and connectedness and tenderness and love. Simon too nourishes his connections to trees and the bush of the birth hills. I like to go up there to that tree and give it a good big slap to feel its solidarity, to be in touch with these ancient things. They've survived for so long, they're hundreds of years old. And he too has a long-standing interest in Noongar culture and ways of being with the land. I try to think what it would have been like here before the whites. I think about Aboriginal occupation and wondered what it was like. And silence strikes me. There's a cone of silence around me. I feel like I'm being watched by the bush in a funny kind of way. The noise, the birds, everything is elsewhere. My caring rule is for the bush, he says, that I just love so much. I don't pretend to have the same connection as the Noongar, but it's still a connection. I try to imagine these landscapes through their Noongar connections, the ceremonies, gathering yams, all this is gone, but it would have been active before. This Nyanya Creek would have been a great place for foods, but also for ceremonies. At least there's a name for it here. So what is striking about these accounts, and again, these are two remarkable human beings, is the commitment to connect with indigenous knowledge beyond Western scientific frames. These two Wajula have come on journeys to country several times with respected Noongar elder, cultural guide, and storyteller, Noel Nunnup, who generously shares his knowledge of living in country. Country is beyond place, it has agency. It asks us to consider what it means to live as part of the world rather than distinct from it. Almost done, 5 minutes, perfect. Well, Simon and Luke were without any doubt the most educated about Indigenous knowledge systems among our research participants. Several others also spoke about what we could all learn from Indigenous heritage. Such desire to ditch hegemonic conceptions obviously opens vital space to move toward a joined socio-nature thinking and envision a different, more caring, and more responsible future. Wendy Harcourt, who positions herself as an Australian white settler, feminist, political ecologist. I think I could be this too, except that I'm not Australian, or not yet. She speaks for a good number of our research participants, and me and my co-authors, I would say, as she grapples with how to best rethink life in common and differential belonging in the Australian landscape in an area of social ecological crisis. Building on other influential feminist scholars in this space, Val Plumwood, Debbie Bird-Rose, Irene Watson, Sarah Wright, Harcourt wrestles with the impossibility of making full sense of otherness and the need to move beyond erasures and not to wallow in white guilt. Instead, she urges us to focus on the possibility of life worlds in which multifaceted belongings of all kinds of beings coexist and co-become. To remake themselves while acknowledging our differential situatedness and complicity in the erasure of others. Drawing on the language of post-humanist feminism and Indigenous cosmovision, she argues for a deep rethink among white settler Australians what caring for country means, and borrowing from Haraway for the practice of reciprocating complexity all the way down. This rethink is in line with what Emily Potter, Fiona Miller, and others demand as part of their manifesto for shadow places, namely uncomfortable grappling with white privilege from the inside. A good number of our research participants articulated similar convictions as they contemplated their connections to their special places. And many who confessed to limited knowledge or interest in Indigenous knowledge also spoke about their shift into a more relational mindset, especially in the wake of the big bushfires. Instead, the sharing of a messy kind of grief that is simultaneously tuned into connection to and abandonment of country also offers the radical hope that healing is conceivable for all of us. And Auntie Anna Polina suggests the demonstratively regenerative and agentic power of land or country becomes a pedagogy of relationality, and climate activism takes the shape of performing new ways of living. And finally, of course, there's no ethics and no politics of placemaking in the post-apocalypse through which we can circumvent the really difficult questions of justice. For Harcourt and her proposal on differential belonging in the landscape, our participants and us, authors included, for us it means listening deeply and sharing responsibility for the adverse changes and damages experienced, witnessed, inflicted, and anticipated. It's not just about listening, it's also about what we're ready to give up in the process of unlearning and to sit with the discomfort and struggle with it. And this wrestling over relational coexistence and negotiating contact zones over the politics of belonging opens a door to a type of hope that is always political and reparative and enmeshed with struggles, despair, and loss. So loss requires engagement, not avoidance. And as Tschakert and Turn argue, internalizing, verbalizing, embodying loss as a lens to grasp social rifts may well fuel rather than drown out political actions. So meaning-focused coping is best achieved through climate activism that also performs new ways of living. Luke, our climate justice champion, sees the politics of placemaking as going hand in hand with organizing. I turn to collective action, organizing, building power in my community, and leverage change. Once we start looking at what is beneficial for all of us, then we can redesign our society, look after our earth, because that's what we rely on. Now, wrapping up, last slide. Scholarship on anti-colonial and modern human practices towards more just futures is not so much driven by galvanizing anger and other negative emotions, but by genuine commitment to enfranchise collectively the so-called passive emotions that are typically associated with lower levels of control: sadness, despair, worry, fear, disappointment, regret, that featured so prominently in our walking journeys. By re-employing and subverting these emotions to overcome paralysis, new entry points to entangled webs of recognition, empathy, shared vulnerabilities, and responsibilities can emerge, and they help us mobilize engagement for climate action. Recent advantages and advances in multi-species justice I've been involved with are very much focused on building diverse and deliberative coalitions and solidarities across scales of mattering. In the face of continuous devastation, destruction, irreversible losses, and the really difficult road to salvage and recovery. The sense of joint suffering and joint loss and grief is also at the core of the post-apocalyptic discourse, something Luke and Simon see quite clearly. These walking journeys then afford residents a slow space to engage with these climatic-affective atmospheres. Not all were equally interested or capable of digging deep into their emotional repertoire. A few felt weather extremes and incremental climate change were secondary to other concerns, such as urban infill, Those who generally took up the challenge appreciated the safe space in a cherished place, therapy outdoors, to give witness regarding their emotional journeys, tensions, and contradictions. Yet only a few appeared emotionally equipped to wrestle with the inevitable loss in the unfolding post-apocalyptic reality, and were able to convert their complex grieving into motivational agents to become part of creating a better world. A critical awareness of the power of non-Western discourses and worldviews, particularly indigenous caring for country, opens a vital space for acknowledging both the past that never was and the future that ought to be prefigured. Nonetheless, of course, much more needs to be done to enable society at large, including the younger generations, to safely and openly share their worries about climate-related loss, comprehend and become at ease with collective vulnerabilities. Now, how do we, and maybe this is my call out to all of you in ACAD and beyond, so how do we best enfranchise grief and nourish empathetic relationships and responsibilities with human and more than human fellow denizens on a trajectory towards an affective politics of hope? How do we do it? I'm looking forward to questions, suggestions, possibilities for collaboration. And thank you so much for listening.